Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are, and welcome to the Servoy 8.3 launch series, where Sean Devlin will be presenting in 3 sessions. Good morning, Sean.
Hey, Jan. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, the sound is pretty good. I think you have a new microphone, isn't it? It sounds very good.
Okay. Jan sent me a microphone, and he likes to remind me how nice it sounds every time I use it.
I think everyone will appreciate the quality of your microphone. All right, well, we have a very nice topic to cover today, which is a new capability of Servoy 8.3, which is connecting to stored procedures in a very easy way. It used to be possible, but you needed to know the name and what arguments to pass, and then build a lot of code to data bind it to a form, and we've made that really easy in Servoy 8.3. So that's what we're going to talk about today. If you do have any questions, feel free to post them on the right-hand side in the questions channel. Let me make sure that the webinar is being recorded as well. I think it is. That looks okay. All right, Sean, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Jan. So as is the tradition with these webinars, we'll start with showing you something first. That way, if you don't like it, you can leave before you hear me talk about it and show slides. And today we're going to do 3 demos about the new stored procedure integration that's available in Servoy 8.3. The first example, we'll look at how we can turn stored procedures to data sources. Then the second one, we'll look at a little more involved example of that. And then on the third one, we'll look at sort of calling back-end business logic using a stored procedure. So let's jump right over to our demo. You can see here I have an example solution. This one is showing a form which is based on the results of a stored procedure, a simple one which is kind of blending different tables into one. So we have here a table that we call contacts, but it's really customers, suppliers, employees. They share sort of common fields, so it makes sense that you might want to look for them separately. So I'm just going to do a quick search here, put in King. You can see that I get several records, but the contact type is different for each one: customers, employees, and suppliers. You know, I could search further down and just find the employee, and if I could type, and then you can see I narrow it down to 1 record. So I think you get the idea. Just for another example, I could do France, and I could show, well, suppliers in France, something like that. Let's take a look at how we produce something like this. I think it makes sense to start with the stored procedure itself, although that's not really the point of this. I think it helps to see that this is a real procedure. In this case, it's in a PostgreSQL database. So I have a function here called getContacts. You can see that it's just defined as a simple SQL function. So of course I could have done this in Query Builder and Servoy really easily. However, the use case for this is that maybe you have a bunch of legacy data sets that you've configured or coded, and you want to reuse them. So it will show you how easy it is to generate a data source from those. So you can see that it's just unioning different types of tables into one common table and returning that. I did create a custom data type called contacts, which has the fields in it. So that's the stored procedure definition. Now, how does Servoy integrate with that? If we come into our IDE, the first thing that I would point out is that whenever you're looking at the settings for any database server connection, you'll see a new property called enabled procedures. By default, this will be turned off. So if you want to enable procedures on your data source, you want to come in and make sure that this is enabled. After you've done that, you would see a new node in the Solution Explorer right underneath your database server, and this is for your procedures. Clicking on that, and you'll see your procedures load in the lower panel. Now, PostgreSQL comes with a bunch of additional functions right in the main catalog there, but I'll jump to our get contacts one right here. So you can see that my own custom procedure shows up here. Now, if I want to take that and convert it to a data source, we have a nice feature where you just right-click and you select Create in-mem table from procedure. Once you do that, you pick the solution and you give your data source a name. Of course, I prepared this in advance, so I'll just show you the one that I already made. So if I look at my in-memory data sources here, you can see that I have set up one already called contacts. So if we take a look at that, this is what gets generated automatically. So I don't have to come in here and add the columns. It just comes right in because it's actually sort of looking into what the return type of the stored procedure is, and it's always going to return a data set, but it infers what the values will be in that data set. It could also return an array of data sets, which we see in a lot of legacy systems, particularly for like master detail types of things. But in this case, it's just returning one data set, and it knows the column types from that automatically. The only thing I had to do is I came in here and told it which columns were going to be the PK, and in this case, it's just a unique combination of the contact type and the name. So once I have that, I want to load my data source, and I'm taking advantage of an event here that was introduced pretty recently in Servoy 8.2, I believe, which is the OnLoad event of the table, and in this case it's a temp table, so the on found set load gets called the first time you sort of touch that or refer to it, and it only takes one line of code. And what I would point out here is the SP here. This is a new kind of data source in Servoy 8.3, and I'll give you some code complete just to kind of show you. So if I do data sources dot, traditionally we would see DB and then mem for the in-memory data sources. Well, now it gives us a new category, SP for stored procedure. I pick available servers. Of course, example data is the only one where I had that checkbox, enable procedures, so that shows up. Then I get a list of all my procedures, and I narrow it down to get contacts, and you can see that the return type is a JS data set, and with any JS data set, you can convert that into an in-memory data source or a temporary table with one extra line, the create data source. In this particular event, the name of the data source gets passed in, so you just sort of pass that through because that's the one that's being requested to be created. So that fills it. So the moment the solution loads and you touch that table, this gets created and populated when that procedure gets called. This is maybe a tangent just about the in-memory data sources in general, but since Servoy 8.1, they are available as design time objects. So if I wanted to create a form, all I have to do is make a new form, and you can see when I select the data source that contacts for the in-memory data source comes right up. So once you have that defined, you can work with it just like any other design time data source that might be based on a real table. Let's take a look at a second example that's a bit more involved. Let me close all these here. Come back to the client, and I'm going to jump down to a form called product summary. So the purpose of this form here is to show products and to show some key, KPIs, some key indicators about these products that aren't available in the basic table. So you can see the total number of orders, the total sales, and the total volume that's been sold for a particular product, and that's changing as I change this. Now, of course, again, these are based on SQL aggregates, so you could do it quite easily in Query Builder, but we want to reuse, maybe we have thousands or hundreds of existing procedures and we don't want to rewrite them, we want to reuse them. That's the idea here. So I guess we'll quickly take a look at the procedure that we're going to use. It makes sense to start there. I created one here called product summary. And you can see, again, this is just a fairly simple SQL procedure here that's just going to return a new type, which I called product summary. You can see my custom types down here. So I defined the custom type and I wrote the SQL to return that. Pretty easy to do. And again, when we go back to Servoy Developer, we would look for our procedure. Again, in our procedures node, I look for the get, I think it's just called product summary. Yeah, the product summary. And again, I just created the in-memory table. If I want to look for what that looks like, it's down here, the mem product summary, and this is what got generated. So really, these are the three aggregates that you saw there on the form, and they just get returned as a data set, in this case for all the products. So this could be something that you call at the beginning and you cache and you just sort of hang on to, or something that you refresh. I actually wrote a version of this that just takes one product ID for refreshing it. Let's take a look at when the event fires. And again, this is very simple. So now we've done two different data sources based on procedures the same way. On-found set load event fires the first time it's touched, and we again find that stored procedure, and when we call it, it returns the JS data set, which we can convert to a data source. Now let's take a look at a third, more involved example. In this case, let's say we want to run some business logic, and what we're seeing a lot recently is some customers that are using Servoy the way that it's it really shines, which is with database objects and data-bound stuff. But they do have a lot of procedures for business logic that they want to take advantage. We're seeing this in particularly in the progress market, for example. One nice approach is to use Servoy for the direct data binding, but then to also augment that with calling existing procedures. So we're going to simulate that here by looking at orders. Let's say that we want to, let's find an order with coffee on it. So here I have some orders here with coffee, and what I want to do is sort of allocate this order so that it deducts from inventory. And you can see that there's 25 units of coffee on this particular order. Let's say we have a back-end procedure that does all kinds of complicated stuff, checking inventory, maybe doing some other things, and we don't want to rewrite that. So let's also bring up the same product in our product summary form here. You can see that there's 20 units in stock, and on the order there's 25. So we should go below inventory on that when we allocate this order. So I'm going to push the allocate button. You can see that it ran for a minute, and then it notified us that the order was allocated, and now the allocate button is disabled. And if we go over to the product summary now, you can see that the number of units in stock has gone below 0. It's highlighted in red to indicate that it's unavailable. Let's take a look at how that happened, because that code was not executed in Servoy. That was done in the back end. So I think the easiest thing to do would be to bring up the method that gets called when we push that button. So this is a Servoy method, which is happening right on click of that button. And the first thing I do is I show that allocated order using the block UI. Then I simulated something which would take a while because it actually runs really fast and you don't see it. But that's just more for cosmetics. Right here is the line that really does all the work. You can see that, again, I use that data sources.sp, and I bring up the data source and the allocate order function. You'll notice that when I do that, and I'll just do that in code complete to show you, that you can see the parameter order ID is found. So not only does it show you the procedures, not only does it look into the data type that's returned and the columns in a data set if it's a data set, but it also looks at the parameters and the data type. So we know that we need to pass an order ID to specify which order gets allocated. So that's all done for you by the IDE. All you have to do is supply the parameters. So we're using the order ID of the current record, so that's pretty easy. And it returns a data set. In this case, it's not meant to return a whole table, but all stored procedures return a data set regardless. So even if the return type in the stored procedure, in this case, it was just a Boolean, it's going to be in the data set. So that's why I did this get value at the end, row 1, column 1, because there's just going to be one thing. And it's going to be either true or false. So that's the success. Another thing to note is that when you're calling procedures, if they're doing things in the database, Servoy runs on caching. So if any records that you've already looked at or found sets are loaded, they're already cached, and it doesn't know that they've changed in the backend system. So it's kind of on you to remember to deal with that if you need to. And we provide a couple of APIs for doing that. We've done a whole webinar related to this topic. But just suffice to say, you know, a couple 2 easy ways are to flush all client cache for a particular table. That will notify all clients of an update, kind of a brute force. It has them reload all those caches. The more nuanced way is the notify data change, where you just say, hey, here are the records that have changed. That's a bit more lightweight. In this case, I just had to flush all client cache and said, you know, the products table has been modified. And that's why I didn't have to do anything else when I switched over to my products form. And you saw the units on order was in red. It was the flush cache that caused that, and it was immediately updated. So after that, I just hide the UI and I show the little toaster. But it's really this one line of code here that does everything. So that's just an example of calling business logic on the back end using a stored procedure. Those are the 3 examples. I just want to go through a quick recap of what we saw, and also let's talk about the use cases first. So one reason we added this was not just because we thought it would be fun. We'd actually been getting lots and lots of requests for this. The reason is, I think nowadays we're seeing a lot more applications that are being modernized as opposed to total rewrites. Businesses want to leverage as much of existing systems that they have. And so this is one area where you can reuse, legacy code. We saw the 2 examples, stored procedures as whole data sources. And I should say that I didn't show what happens when you update one of these temp tables, and that's certainly supported. Procedures can take a data set or multiple data sets as input parameters as well, and then the backend logic handles how those changes get processed. So we see a lot of systems lately that are, I shouldn't say a lot, but we're seeing enough systems lately that are really like, you don't touch the database directly. You go through procedures, and everything is in data sets. We see that a lot in the Progress community, for example. Then again, we saw specific business logic functions that are run more for logic, less about just data access. Another thing that I would point out is that there's a lot of good vendor-specific database functions out there. For example, Postgres has support for JSON objects. It has support. They have a whole extension for GIS or geospatial extensions. So you can do things like spatial queries, show me all the records that fall within this box, or show me all the records that are within 100 miles of each other, that sort of thing. There's all kinds of built-in functions for that, and you saw all those list of system functions. If I were to add one of those extensions to Postgres, you would have seen those come up right there, and I'd be able to just call them directly right from the IDE. So that's another added benefit of being able to see these functions directly. So real quick, we'll just go over what we did. The first step is you got to enable procedures. It's not enabled by default, so you go in and I highlighted the wrong one. It just occurred to me there. I'll fix the slide. It should be the one below it that's highlighted in yellow, enable procedures, not just enabled. Wouldn't be a webinar if I didn't have one of those in there. The next thing that will happen is you'll see that on the Solution Explorer, the procedures node is available. If you click on it down below, you'll see a list of all the procedures that are available on that data source, and you can find the one that you need. If you want to create an in-memory data source from it, right-click is your friend, and you create the mem table, and you'll get something like this here, where it finds all of the column names and the data types. Do remember that you have to set a row ident or a PK. It doesn't know that just based on the procedure. At least I don't think it's possible to know that. I might be wrong. After that, you need to call the procedure if you want to load it as a data source. The way that you call a procedure programmatically, there's a new SP data source type. So you'll get that in code complete when you do data sources dot. and that will call the procedure directly. It'll also suggest what the parameters should be, and these always return a JS data set. Doesn't matter what the procedure definition is, it will return a data set, even if it returns a single value that will be packed in a data set. From there, it's one-liner to create a data source from a JS data set. And from there, all the design time stuff applies to those as regular data sources. We saw the example where you execute business logic. The syntax is exactly the same. In this case, we were passing an order ID, so that's going to show up as one of the parameters. And we didn't return a data set. We're not binding that result to a data source. In this case, we're just running some logic. So do remember to flush cache. It's not going to be updated automatically if you know tables have changed in the back end. That's really it. We're happy to take questions now. I'll leave these links up, and Servoy 8.3 is out as a release candidate. I really recommend that you download today and try it out and get your any bugs that you find submitted before we go with final release.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions coming in, and feel free to continue posting questions as we go through them. And the first one is from Chris. Is there a way to bind a stored procedure to a data broadcast for a specific table or set of tables?
I'm not sure I fully understand. You can call a stored procedure, and then you can broadcast the change. So if you've called a stored procedure and you know that it's changed something in the back end, the plugins.raw SQL.notify data change, it's in there in the one example that I showed, that will initiate a data broadcast to all clients. So that's probably the way you want to go for that.
Yeah, and if you want to do the other way around, so if you want to trigger a stored procedure when a data broadcast event is happening,
okay. Yeah, there's an event for that. Yeah, it's on the solution level on data broadcast.
Those are events that you want to use with caution, though. You can, if you have thousands of users and you're flushing the cache all the time, then that's going to have an impact on your performance, because your app server will go back to your database and requery it every time. So with great power comes responsibility. So make sure when you're using those powerful events that you know what you're doing.
Do we have more questions?
Kim is asking, is row ident equal to primary key new in 8.3? I don't think it is it?
Row ident and primary key are separate, although on the memory data sources, you get to say what the primary key is, because those are totally user defined. So typically, if your table doesn't have a primary key, it won't come in. You don't get to set it, but you do get to say what the row ident is to let Servoy know what columns make up a unique row. In this case, you can use either row ident or primary key because it's user defined.
All right, there's a question from Paul. Can this be used by all clients?
Yes, this is available for NG client and the classic web client and the smart client, a headless client, because it's all happening in the back end.
Okay. Is there an easy way to see which features work with which clients in Servoy?
I don't know if that's related to the topic we showed. Almost everything is supported across the board, but there are some exceptions, and I think the answer to that is no. It's not too easy to see unless you look at a specific function, and then it'll tell you what it's supported in. It should tell you what it's supported in, or what it's not supported in. So, for example, plugins.dialogues, or showing a form and a modal dialog works differently in the legacy web client, but those are a few exceptions.
Excellent. And actually, one of my favorite features is going to be showed on Friday, which initially we couldn't support in NG client, which is the client design mode, which we had in smart client and in web client, and it's now coming to the NG client. But for that, you'll have to tune in on Friday. And what's the topic on Wednesday, Sean?
Right. So Wednesday we're going to do the multi-tenancy. So we've added sort of built-in support for multi-tenancy and also some performance enhancements around that. So if you're interested in multi-tenancy, then I would tune into that webinar because we've had some changes.
Cool. All right. Well, it looks like all questions are covered. We will be posting this recording to our website very soon. And as Jan mentioned, please do download Servoy 8.3 and give it a spin, even if you don't plan to use it very soon. It always helps in getting us feedback before we do an actual product release. And we look forward to seeing you on Wednesday. And Jan, thanks for presenting.
Thank you.